The air over Hawaii in December 1941 was thick with the smell of oil and ruin. Out of this smoke and sorrow, a man was sent to take command of a fleet that barely existed anymore. He was tasked not with victory, but with survival. He was told to hold the line with what little he had and to do the impossible. In his pocket, he reportedly carried a small, folded piece of paper with a simple prayer asking for serenity, courage, and wisdom. One has to wonder what kind of mind, what kind of soul is forged to face a moment like that. His story begins not with the roar of ocean waves, but in the quiet hills of Central Texas. Don't forget to like, leave a comment, and subscribe. You are not here by accident. Chester William Nimitz was born in Fredericksburg, a small, landlocked town settled by German immigrants. There was no sea, no harbor, only the rolling landscape of a country he would one day serve. His father passed away before he was born, leaving him to be raised by his mother and his paternal grandfather, a figure who seemed to cast a shadow as long as the state itself. This was a world of hard work and quiet duty, a place where a person's word was their bond, and extravagance was a foreign concept. The grandfather, Charles Henry Nimitz, was a man who had lived a life of adventure before settling down. A former mariner in the German merchant marine, he never truly left the sea behind. He built the town's main hotel in the shape of a steamboat, a strange and wonderful monument to a distant world. It was here, on the deck of this landlocked ship, that a young Chester would listen to tales of the ocean's vastness and its unforgiving nature. His grandfather's words were not just stories, they were lessons. The sea, he would say, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster. It demands respect, preparation, and a calm head. Yet for all this early exposure to maritime lore, the Navy was not his first choice. It was not even a dream. The young Nimitz, seeking a path to a free college education, set his sights on the United States Military Academy at West Point. He wanted to be a soldier. But life, as his grandfather taught, often has other plans. When he learned there were no appointments available for West Point, a local congressman offered him an alternative, a single opening at the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Was this a turn of fate or simply the next open door for a determined young man? Annapolis was a world of rigid discipline and relentless competition, a crucible designed to smelt character or break it. For a boy from the Texas hills, it must have been a profound shock. Here, his quiet resolve and analytical mind found their purpose. He was not the most brilliant cadet, nor the most charismatic. He was steady. He was thorough. He graduated 7th in his class of 114, a strong performance that hinted at a deep competence rather than a fiery genius. It was in these formative years, under the constant pressure of the academy, that the foundations of the future admiral were laid, brick by methodical brick. The quiet observer was learning to become a commander. His first assignment after Annapolis was aboard the battleship USS Ohio, the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. It was a world of polished brass and rigid hierarchy, the very picture of naval power at the dawn of the 20th century. For a young ensign, it was an education in the traditions and mechanics of a fleet built around these steel behemoths. He moved through the predictable steps of a junior officer, learning navigation, gunnery, and the intricate dance of shipboard life. From the outside, his path seemed set, a conventional career in the surface fleet. But was this the world that truly captured his mind? Something then shifted. The Navy was entering a new age of technology, and one of its most dangerous and unproven frontiers was beneath the waves. Submarines. These were not the sleek hunters of a later era, but cramped, volatile machines, often called pig boats for their foul air and perilous conditions. They were considered a fringe service, a dead end for an ambitious officer. Yet, in 1909, Chester Nimitz volunteered for the submarine service. It was a move that baffled many of his peers. Why trade the prestige of a battleship bridge for the claustrophobic confines of a gasoline-powered submersible? The decision thrust him into a world of constant risk. Early submarines were prone to battery explosions, toxic fumes, and catastrophic mechanical failures. Command was a hands-on, life-or-death affair. He took command of the USS Plunger, a vessel that offered its crew little more than a steel tube between them and the crushing pressure of the deep. Here, a captain was not just an officer, but also a chief engineer, a mechanic, and a leader who had to command absolute trust in the most terrifying of circumstances. It was an environment that stripped away all pretense, rewarding only cold competence and a steady nerve. His superiors saw something in his quiet command style. He was given a succession of submarine commands, each one a vote of confidence in his ability to handle these temperamental machines. He commanded the first submarine flotilla. He became an expert not just in operating submarines, but in understanding their potential. While many in the naval establishment still saw them as a coastal defense novelty, could it be that Nimitz was already glimpsing their future as a weapon of strategic importance, a tool for a different kind of naval warfare? He was also a teacher, an evangelist for this new form of sea power. He oversaw the construction and commissioning of new diesel engines for the Navy, a critical technological leap that made submarines safer and more capable. He was becoming one of the Navy's foremost authorities on a subject that most admirals knew little about and trusted even less. This early specialization placed him outside the mainstream, but it also gave him a unique perspective. He was learning to think asymmetrically, to see the vulnerabilities in a fleet built entirely around massive, visible warships. This period of his career was not without its stumbles. In fact, it was marked by a mistake that could have ended it entirely. While in command of the destroyer USS Decatur, running at night in the Philippines, he ran the ship aground on a mudbank. It was a navigator's error, a lapse in judgment, and the kind of incident the Navy does not forgive lightly. The young lieutenant was court-martialed for hazarding a naval vessel. The verdict was guilty. His career, it seemed, was over before it had truly begun. The sentence was a public letter of reprimand. For a proud officer, the humiliation must have been immense. It was a formal, permanent mark on his record, a testament to a failure of command. Many officers would have been sidelined, their prospects for advancement dimmed forever. But perhaps the incident taught him something that success never could. A lesson in humility, in the fallibility of even the most careful commander. How does a leader recover from such a public failure? Does it break them, or does it forge a deeper caution and a more profound sense of responsibility? For Nimitz, it seemed to be the latter. He did not quit. He did not fade away. He returned to his duties, the reprimand a shadow in his file. The Navy, for its part, seemed willing to look past the mistake, perhaps recognizing that the underlying quality of the officer was worth more than the single error. When the United States entered the First World War in 1917, he was not sent into the heart of the U-boat battles in the North Atlantic. His expertise was deemed too valuable to risk in a single command. Instead, he was made Chief of Staff to the commander of the submarine force, Atlantic Fleet. It was a desk job, far from the thrill of combat patrol. His war was fought with charts, reports, and logistics tables. He was instrumental in the enormous task of organizing, training, and deploying a submarine force that was still in its infancy. It was a different kind of battle, a war against time, mechanical failure, and the immense logistical challenges of projecting power across an ocean. It lacked glory, but it demanded a mastery of detail and a broad strategic vision. While other officers were earning medals for command at sea, Nimitz was learning how an entire fleet functions, or fails to. He was at the nexus of strategy, technology, and personnel, seeing the whole intricate machine from the inside. This experience gave him a perspective that a line officer, focused on a single ship, might never gain. He was learning the art of naval administration on a grand scale, the unglamorous but essential work that makes victory possible. Was this seeming detour from a combat career actually the most important preparation he could have had for the challenges to come? After the war, his path took another intellectual turn. He was sent to the Naval War College, the Navy's premier institution for strategic thought. Here, the focus was not on how to sail a ship, but on why and where to sail it. It was an environment of deep study and rigorous debate, where officers wrestled with the geopolitical realities of a changing world. It was here that Nimitz and his contemporaries spent years studying the Navy's most pressing strategic problem, the likelihood of a future war with the Empire of Japan. They analyzed geography, logistics, industrial capacity, and national will. They wargamed countless scenarios for a conflict in the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. This was the laboratory where the core concepts of the campaign that would one day be his to command were first developed. The long, arduous island-hopping strategy, the critical importance of logistics, the need for carrier aviation. These ideas were not invented in a moment of crisis in 1942. They were methodically thought through in the quiet halls of Newport decades earlier. Nimitz excelled in this environment. He wasn't just a student, he became an instructor, shaping the next generation of naval thinkers. His work involved refining War Plan Orange, the operational plan for a war against Japan. He understood, perhaps better than most, the tyranny of distance in the Pacific and the immense challenge of projecting American power across thousands of miles of ocean against a determined enemy. It was a puzzle of staggering complexity, and he dedicated his mind to solving it. His career continued its steady, upward climb. He established the first Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps unit at the University of California, Berkeley, a testament to his belief in the importance of a well-educated officer corps. He was building the Navy of the future, both in terms of strategy and personnel. His quiet competence and intellectual rigor were becoming his trademark. He was not a firebrand. He did not seek the spotlight. He simply produced results. He was promoted to captain and given command of a cruiser, the USS Augusta, then the flagship of the Asiatic Fleet. He was back in the world he first entered as an ensign, but now he was in command. He served tours in Washington, D.C. as an assistant to the Chief of the Bureau of Navigation, the office responsible for the Navy's personnel. This gave him an intimate knowledge of the Navy's talent pool, the strengths and weaknesses of its senior officers. He knew who was good, who was steady, and who was brilliant. It was a unique and powerful form of intelligence. By the late 1930s, he was a rear admiral, commanding cruiser and battleship divisions. He had reached the flag ranks, the pinnacle of his profession. He was respected throughout the service as a thoughtful, knowledgeable, and imperturbable leader. He was seen as a safe pair of hands, a man you could trust with the Navy's most powerful assets. But was he seen as a wartime commander? A man who could lead in the crucible of a desperate, losing fight? His career had been one of preparation, of study, of building. He had never been truly tested in the chaos of battle. That test arrived on a quiet Sunday morning in December 1941. The news from Pearl Harbor was not a report, it was a cataclysm. In a few short hours, the heart of American naval power in the Pacific had been torn out. The commander on the scene, Admiral Husband Kimmel, was professionally and personally shattered, his career ending in the smoke of his burning fleet. In Washington, a sense of shock gave way to a desperate search for someone, anyone, who could salvage the situation. The choice fell on the man who had spent his career preparing for a war just like this one, though perhaps he never imagined he would be called to lead it from the brink of such a catastrophic defeat. President Franklin Roosevelt reportedly brushed aside other more senior candidates. He wanted Nimitz. He wanted a man with a fresh perspective, untainted by the political infighting and strategic assumptions that may have contributed to the disaster. He wanted a steady hand, not a vengeful one. And so, Chester Nimitz was summoned, promoted over dozens of other officers to the rank of full admiral, and given a 4-star command that was, at that moment, more of a title than a reality. He was now Commander-in-Chief, United States Pacific Fleet, a fleet that lay in ruins at the bottom of a harbor. When he arrived in Hawaii just before the new year, he stepped into a scene of utter devastation. The hulks of proud battleships, including the Arizona, were still visible, grim monuments to the Navy's darkest day. The air was thick with recrimination and despair. Morale was non-existent. Nimitz's first actions were telling. He did not launch an investigation or seek scapegoats. He met with Kimmel, the man he was replacing, and treated him with a quiet dignity that surprised many. His focus was not on who to blame for the past, but on how to fight in the future. He looked at the wreckage and saw not just loss, but opportunity. The Japanese, he famously remarked, had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. The strategic situation was beyond grim. The Japanese Empire was advancing on all fronts, a seemingly unstoppable tide. The Philippines were falling. Malaya and Singapore were collapsing. The Dutch East Indies were next. It seemed as if nothing could stand in their way. Nimitz's orders were simple, yet almost impossible. Hold the line. Protect the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia. Do it with what you have left. And what he had left were his submarines, and crucially, the 3 aircraft carriers that had been at sea on the day of the attack. They were all that stood between the Japanese Navy and total domination of the Pacific. His headquarters was not a grand office, but a command center, where the most important battles were fought not with guns, but with information. Deep within the basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor, a team of cryptanalysts worked in secrecy and under immense pressure. Led by the brilliant, eccentric, and often insubordinate Commander Joseph Rochefort, this unit, known as Station Hypo, was desperately trying to break Japan's main naval code. They were the ears of the fleet, straining to hear the enemy's whispers across thousands of miles of ocean. And Nimitz understood, with a clarity that others lacked, that his entire strategy depended on what these men could decipher. In the spring of 1942, the whispers grew louder. Rochefort and his team began to piece together fragments of a massive Japanese plan. They knew a major offensive was coming. They knew it was designed to be the final, decisive blow that would eliminate the American carriers and end the war. They even knew the target, a location the Japanese referred to with the code letters AF. But what was AF? The intelligence community in Washington was convinced it meant somewhere in the South Pacific, or perhaps even the Aleutian Islands. Rochefort, however, working from his own analysis, was certain He believed AF was a small, strategically vital atoll in the middle of the Pacific. He believed the target was Midway. Nimitz was now faced with a decision of almost unimaginable weight. His superiors in Washington disagreed with the assessment from his man in the basement. To commit his entire fragile fleet based on the instincts of a codebreaker was a gamble that could lose the war in a single afternoon. So he and Rochefort devised an ingenious test. They instructed the American garrison on Midway to send out an uncoded radio message, a piece of false information claiming their freshwater distillation plant had broken down. A few days later, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese communication. The message noted that AF was short on fresh water. The trap had been sprung. Rochefort was right. Now Nimitz knew. He knew the target, and he had a good idea of the timing. The Japanese plan, orchestrated by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, was a masterpiece of complexity, involving multiple fleets converging on Midway from different directions. But its complexity was its weakness. It relied on surprise. Nimitz, armed with Rochefort's intelligence, intended to turn that surprise against them. He began to gather his forces. The carriers Enterprise and Hornet were recalled from the South Pacific. The Yorktown, heavily damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea, limped into Pearl Harbor. Experts said she needed months of repairs. Nimitz gave them 3 days, working around the clock. Shipyard workers performed a miracle, patching the carrier together just enough to get her back into the fight. He laid his own trap, one of stunning simplicity and audacity. He would let the Japanese strike force approach Midway, believing the American fleet was far away. He positioned his 3 carriers, his entire offensive power in the Central Pacific, at a single point northeast of the island, a spot the sailors would later call Point Luck. There, they would wait, hidden over the horizon, for the Japanese carriers to reveal themselves. He was betting everything on one moment, on one battle. There was no fallback plan. There was no margin for error. The fate of the war in the Pacific would be decided in the next few hours. On the 4th of June, 1942, the battle began. The first wave of Japanese planes struck Midway Island, just as Nimitz had anticipated. The American fighters and bombers based on the atoll rose to meet them, flying into a wall of fire. They fought with incredible bravery, but they were overwhelmed. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. They disrupted the Japanese attack, and more importantly, they forced the Japanese commander, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, to prepare a second strike on the island. At that critical moment, his scout planes finally located the American carriers. Nagumo was caught in a fatal moment of indecision. His flight decks were a scene of controlled chaos, with crews frantically trying to switch their plane's armament from bombs for a land attack to torpedoes for a naval one. It was at this precise moment of maximum vulnerability that the American carrier planes arrived. The first to attack were the torpedo bombers. Flying low and slow, they were nearly annihilated by the Japanese fighter patrols and anti-aircraft fire. Of the 41 torpedo planes that took part, only a handful returned. But like the flyers from Midway, their sacrifice had a purpose. They had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to sea level, leaving the skies above the fleet undefended. And into that opening came the dive bombers from the Enterprise and the Yorktown. They plunged down through the empty sky, almost unopposed. In the space of about 5 minutes, their bombs struck the Japanese carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Laden with fuel, ordnance, and armed aircraft, they erupted in a series of catastrophic explosions. A fourth carrier, the Hiryu, was found and destroyed later that day. Back in his windowless basement headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Nimitz received the reports. 4 of the enemy's finest carriers, the very ships that had attacked this base 6 months earlier, were now burning wrecks. The core of Japan's naval aviation was gone. The seemingly invincible tide of their advance had not just been stopped, it had been decisively thrown back. It was one of the most stunning and complete victories in the history of naval warfare. Nimitz, the quiet, intellectual admiral who had never commanded a fleet in battle, had just orchestrated a masterpiece. He had taken a shattered command, trusted his people, taken an enormous risk, and changed the course of the war. The Texas boy from a landlocked town had just mastered the Pacific. The reports that reached Chester Nimitz in his Pearl Harbor command post were not a clear, triumphant narrative. They were a chaotic storm of fragments, a pilot's frantic voice crackling over the radio, then silence, a garbled message about smoke on the horizon, long periods of nothing, where the fate of hundreds of ships and thousands of men hung in an agonizing void. For the men in that underground room, the 5 minutes of dive bomber attacks that changed the war were an eternity of suspense. They did not know the Japanese carriers were burning. They only knew their own torpedo squadrons had been torn to pieces. For a time, it must have seemed like a catastrophe. The first wave of attacks, the torpedo planes from the Hornet and the Enterprise, were reporting devastating losses for almost no gain. Was this the entire result of his colossal gamble? Had he sent the best of his men on a suicide mission, only to fail? The plan depended on coordinated strikes, but in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, coordination was a fantasy. Squadrons became separated. Pilots, low on fuel, searched desperately for a target that seemed to have vanished. The entire intricate plan, so carefully laid, seemed to be unraveling in the fog of war. It was a crisis of information. Nimitz, the ultimate controller of this immense battle, was paradoxically the person furthest from the action. He could not see the sky, could not feel the rumble of the engines, could not smell the cordite. He was a mind connected by tenuous electronic threads to a battle 1,000 miles away. Every decision he had made, every risk he had taken, was now in the hands of young men flying fragile machines over an unforgiving ocean. All he could do was wait and trust. Trust in the intelligence, trust in his commanders, and trust in the training of his pilots. The weight of it is difficult to comprehend. He had committed the entirety of America's remaining naval power in the Pacific to this one engagement. There was no reserve. If his 3 carriers were lost, the west coast of the United States would be open to attack. The war could be lost. Right here, on this one day. The quiet calm he projected to his staff was a mask of command, a necessary fiction to maintain morale. But underneath, what was he thinking as the first reports of failure and loss trickled in? Did he question his own audacity? Then, through the static, came a different kind of message. A pilot from the Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, flying on little more than instinct and fumes, had spotted a lone Japanese destroyer. Guessing it was heading back to its fleet, he changed course to follow. It was a decision made by one man, alone in the cockpit, that may have altered the course of history. His squadron of dauntless dive bombers arrived over the Japanese fleet at the exact moment of its greatest vulnerability. It was a convergence of luck, sacrifice, and skill that no planner, not even Nimitz, could have ever designed. The reports that followed were so stunning, so overwhelmingly positive, they were almost unbelievable. One carrier on fire, then another, then a third. The methodical, almost detached language of the naval dispatches could not conceal the sheer scale of the reversal. The hunters had become the hunted. The architects of Pearl Harbor were now watching their own fleet burn. For Nimitz, this was not just a tactical victory, it was a validation of his entire philosophy of command. He had trusted his intelligence officers when others were skeptical. He had trusted his shipyard crews to perform a miracle, and he had trusted his pilots to find a way. Yet even in this moment of incredible triumph, the battle was not over. The fourth Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, was still at large. It launched its own counterstrike, and its planes found the Yorktown. The same carrier that had been miraculously resurrected in Pearl Harbor was now struck again, left dead in the water and listing heavily. The cost of this victory was still being counted. The crisis was not fully past until the Hiryu was finally located and sunk, and the remnants of the Japanese fleet turned for home. Only then could the men in the Pearl Harbor bunker begin to process what had just happened. The victory at Midway was not the end of the war, but it was, as Churchill would say of another battle, the end of the beginning. It was the moment the bleeding stopped. For Nimitz, it was the culmination of 6 desperate months of holding the line. He had taken a shattered, demoralized force and used it to inflict a wound from which the Imperial Japanese Navy would never fully recover. He had done it not with overwhelming force, but with cunning, risk, and an unshakable faith in his people. The quiet admiral had won his place in the pantheon of great commanders. His reaction to the victory was as telling as the strategy that achieved it. There were no triumphant proclamations, no public gloating. His official dispatch was a model of understated fact. He knew that celebration was a luxury they could not afford. The war in the Pacific was a war of immense distances and brutal attrition. Midway had bought them time and initiative, but the road ahead was still impossibly long and would be paved with the lives of his sailors and Marines. This victory was simply the foundation upon which the real war of liberation could now be built. It fundamentally shifted the balance of power. Before Midway, the Japanese held the strategic initiative, striking where and when they pleased. After Midway, that initiative passed to the United States. Nimitz could now begin to think about offense. He was no longer just plugging holes in a crumbling dam. He could start planning how to dismantle the dam altogether. His command, which had been a desperate holding action, now became the engine of the largest naval campaign in human history. The stakes had been impossibly high, and his success gave him the authority and credibility to shape the conflict to come. This was the true beginning of his great campaign, the island-hopping strategy that would slowly, painfully roll back the Japanese Empire across the Pacific. The names of the battles to come are a litany of sacrifice. Places like Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima. Each was a brutal, self-contained war, demanding new strategies and immense resources. Nimitz, from his headquarters, would oversee it all, a grandmaster moving fleets like chess pieces across a board that spanned a third of the globe. Midway had made it all possible. His relationship with other commanders, particularly General Douglas MacArthur, would define this next phase of the war. The two men were titans of the American military, but they could not have been more different in temperament. MacArthur was theatrical, imperious, and brilliant. Nimitz was reserved, collaborative, and equally brilliant. They commanded parallel wars in the Pacific, one on the sea and one on the land, and their efforts had to be coordinated. It was a clash of egos and strategies that Nimitz had to navigate with the same quiet diplomacy and firm resolve he brought to a naval battle. The scale of his responsibility grew exponentially. By the end of the war, His Pacific Ocean Areas Command was a military enterprise of unprecedented size. He commanded millions of personnel, thousands of warships, and tens of thousands of aircraft. He was, in effect, the military ruler of an empire of water. The quiet man from a small town in Texas, who had joined the Navy when it was still a collection of coal-burning ships, now wielded a level of power that few leaders in history have ever known. This was the true culmination of his career, not just a single battle, however decisive. It was the sustained 4-year campaign of relentless pressure, logistical genius, and strategic foresight that pushed the Allied forces across the ocean to the shores of Japan itself. Midway was the dramatic turning point, the single event that will forever be linked to his name. But the long grind that followed, the methodical and bloody work of winning the war, was his ultimate test as a commander. He bore the burden of every casualty report, every lost ship, every delayed convoy. Unlike a general on the front line, he was insulated from the direct horror of combat, but he was intimately connected to its consequences. Every decision he made or failed to make had a direct impact on the lives of the young men serving under him. This immense, crushing weight was his constant companion. The victory at Midway had been a moment of brilliant clarity, but the war that followed was a long, gray, and arduous struggle. The Pacific Campaign became a brutal equation of logistics and lives. For every island taken, for every mile of ocean reclaimed, there was a price paid in ships and men. The loss of the carrier Hornet in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was a bitter reminder that victory was never guaranteed. Each casualty report that crossed his desk was more than a statistic. It was a personal failure, a life he had been entrusted with and had been unable to bring home. His son, Chester Jr., was serving on submarines in the Pacific, in the most dangerous duty the Navy offered. Every time a submarine was reported overdue, presumed lost, Nimitz must have felt a cold dread that went beyond the strategic loss. This quiet, controlled man rarely showed the strain, but those closest to him saw it. They saw it in the long hours he kept, in the way he would walk alone in the gardens of his headquarters, lost in thought. He was shouldering a burden of command that was almost unimaginable. The decisions he made condemned thousands to their deaths, even in victory. The assault on Tarawa, a tiny atoll, resulted in horrific casualties for the Marines in just a few days. The landings at Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa Iach was a new level of ferocity, a new testament to the enemy's willingness to fight to the last man. How does a man authorize such actions? How does he sleep at night, knowing that his signature on an order will result in a beachhead piled with the bodies of his countrymen? This was the true, hidden cost of his command. It was a slow erosion of the soul, a constant wrestling with a moral calculus that had no right answers. He had to be cold enough to make the decision, yet human enough to understand its cost. He had to sacrifice his men to save even more of them from a longer war. This was the lonely paradox of high command, and Nimitz lived with it every day. He delegated authority with a trust that was legendary, but the ultimate responsibility was always his. He built a team of brilliant, aggressive subordinates, Halsey, Spruance, Turner, and let them fight. But when their plans went wrong, when the cost was too high, the accountability flowed back to his office in Pearl Harbor. He absorbed the criticism, defended his men, and adjusted his strategy. He was the calm center of a storm of violence that spanned an entire ocean, a storm he himself had to direct. As the American war machine drew closer to the Japanese home islands, the fighting grew ever more desperate. The Battle of Okinawa was a vision of what an invasion of Japan would look like. It was a relentless, 3-month campaign of attrition, featuring massed kamikaze attacks that turned the sea around the island into a graveyard of American ships. The losses were staggering, on a scale that shocked a nation already weary of war. The price of victory was becoming almost too high to bear. Nimitz and his planners looked at the estimates for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, and saw a nightmare. The projections were for casualties in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps even 1 million, for the Allied forces alone. The Japanese were preparing to defend their homeland with every man, woman, and child. It promised to be a bloodbath that would make Normandy and Okinawa pale in comparison. Nimitz, the man who felt the weight of every single life lost, was now faced with the prospect of the greatest slaughter in American history. And then, a new factor entered the equation. A weapon of terrible, unprecedented power, the atomic bomb. The decision to use it was not his to make, but his command would be instrumental in its delivery. For a commander dedicated to ending the war and saving the lives of his men, it must have presented an awful, but perhaps necessary, alternative: to trade the instantaneous destruction of 2 cities for the prevention of a prolonged, nationwide battle to the death. The choice was a stark illustration of the brutal logic that had governed his every decision for 4 years. On the 2nd of September, 1945, the war came to its formal end. On the deck of the battleship Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay, the representatives of the Japanese Empire signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. General Douglas MacArthur presided over the ceremony, but it was Chester Nimitz who signed for the United States. It was a quiet, profoundly symbolic moment. The admiral from the landlocked hills of Texas, the man who had taken command when the fleet was a smoking ruin, now stood in the heart of the defeated enemy's waters, accepting their final capitulation. There was no visible triumph in his expression, only a quiet, solemn gravity. The long, gray, and arduous struggle was finally over. He was a man of profound contrasts, a puzzle of personality that even those in his inner circle struggled to fully comprehend. The public saw the serene, almost grandfatherly figure, the 5-star admiral from the Texas Hill Country, who seemed utterly unflappable. He cultivated this image. His folksy wisdom and easygoing manner were disarming, a deliberate strategy in a world of towering egos. He never raised his voice, never postured. But to mistake this quietness for simplicity was a grave error. Beneath the calm exterior was a mind of formidable intellectual power, one that could process staggering amounts of information and discern the critical path through chaos. His leadership style was a study in quiet confidence. In the high-stakes strategy meetings at Pearl Harbor, surrounded by brilliant and often fiercely opinionated officers, Nimitz was frequently the most silent person in the room. He would listen, letting the arguments rage, letting his subordinates tear apart each other's plans. He valued this intellectual friction, believing it forged better strategy. Only after everyone had their say, after every angle had been explored, would he speak. And when he did, his decisions were delivered with a quiet finality that left no room for further debate. He didn't command through intimidation, but through a consensus he patiently allowed to form around his own carefully considered judgment. How did a man carrying such a weight find release? Not in grand gestures, but in small, precise, personal disciplines. He was a superb marksman, finding a strange solace in the focused calm of pistol practice. On the grounds of his headquarters, he would unwind by pitching horseshoes, a simple, repetitive motion that seemed to ground him. He found refuge in classical music, a world of structure and harmony so different from the dissonant violence he orchestrated across the ocean. These were not the hobbies of a warrior king, but of an engineer, a thinker, a man seeking moments of perfect, predictable order in a universe that had spun completely out of control. His greatest talent, perhaps, was not as a strategist, but as a manager of men. He had to harness the raw aggression of Admiral Halsey, the Bull, and the cold, analytical genius of Admiral Spruance. They were polar opposites, yet Nimitz understood that the war required both fire and ice. He trusted them, delegated immense authority, and most importantly, he protected them. When Halsey was criticized for sailing his fleet into a typhoon, Nimitz stood by him. He absorbed the political fallout, knowing that to break his star commander's spirit would be a greater loss than any ship. He built not just a staff, but a team bound by an almost unbreakable sense of mutual loyalty, with himself as its quiet, unshakable anchor. And then there was the man who wrote letters home. To his wife, Catherine, he was not the commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet. He was just Chet, a husband far from home, expressing his loneliness, his weariness, and his deep and abiding love. He wrote about his worries for their children, especially his son, Chester Jr., who was serving on submarines in the same deadly waters he commanded. These letters are the key. They unlock the humanity behind the uniform, revealing the private anxieties of a public figure who could never afford to show a moment of doubt. They remind us that the weight of the Pacific War rested not on a symbol, but on a man. There is a persistent debate that still echoes in the halls of naval academies, a question that goes to the very heart of his command. Was Raymond Spruance the superior admiral to William Halsey? Nimitz needed both, but the question lingers. After Spruance's brilliant, calculated victory at Midway, some felt he was the master strategist. Yet it was Halsey who became the public face of the fighting navy. The flashpoint is often the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where Halsey, baited by a Japanese decoy, sailed his powerful Third Fleet north, leaving the American landing forces terrifyingly vulnerable. It is a move many believe the ever-cautious Spruance would never have made. Nimitz never publicly censured Halsey, but what did he think in private? Was his unwavering loyalty to his most aggressive fighter a calculated risk, or a momentary blind spot that almost led to catastrophe? The silent service, the submarine force, was one of Nimitz's most effective weapons. He unleashed them with a simple directive: to sink enemy shipping wherever it was found. This campaign of unrestricted warfare systematically starved Japan of the resources it needed to fight. But it also operated in a moral gray area. The very tactics the United States had condemned when used by Germany in the Atlantic were now standard practice in the Pacific. Did Nimitz wrestle with this decision? The historical record is largely silent, showing only a commander focused on the swift and effective prosecution of the war. But it is hard to imagine a man of his character did not privately consider the implications of sending men to fight a war in the shadows, where the lines between combatant and non-combatant were forever blurred. His relationship with General Douglas MacArthur was one of the great hidden dramas of the war. On the surface, it was a picture of professional cooperation. Beneath, it was a constant, grinding struggle for resources, for strategic control, for history's favor. MacArthur, theatrical and imperious, envisioned a single, grand, army-led thrust back to the Philippines. Nimitz and the Navy favored a more dispersed, island-hopping campaign that bypassed enemy strongholds. The dual-pronged advance that resulted was a political compromise. But was it the most effective strategy? Some historians argue this division of command, born of inter-service rivalry, may have wasted time and lives. Nimitz's calm, patient demeanor was the perfect foil to MacArthur's flamboyance, but one has to wonder what frustrations simmered just below that placid surface. Perhaps the most telling speculation surrounds his life after the war. Having presided over the culmination of industrial warfare and the dawn of the atomic age, Nimitz became a passionate advocate for the United Nations and for nuclear disarmament. What could prompt such a profound shift in a man who had wielded such immense destructive power? It suggests a man deeply affected by what he had seen. It is as if, having looked into the abyss, he dedicated the remainder of his years to trying to pull the world back from its edge. Was this an act of conscience? A quiet atonement for the terrible necessities of his wartime command? And what of the man himself? Was that legendary calm a gift of temperament, or a mask forged under unimaginable pressure? There are scattered, unconfirmed stories from junior officers, whispers of private meetings where the folksy admiral disappeared, replaced by a man of icy, controlled fury who could dissect a subordinate's failure with surgical precision. These fleeting accounts suggest that the tranquility was a tool of command, a conscious projection of stability for the benefit of 1,000,000 men looking to him for reassurance. The true Chester Nimitz may have been a far more turbulent sea than the calm surface he showed to the world. The final act of the Pacific War played out not in a storm of fire, but in the quiet scratching of a pen on paper. On the deck of the battleship Missouri, under the gaze of the world, Chester Nimitz signed the instrument of surrender for the United States. He was not the supreme commander here. That title belonged to MacArthur, who orchestrated the ceremony with his typical flair for the dramatic. Nimitz was a quieter presence, the man who had represented the steady, relentless pressure that had brought the Japanese Empire to this very spot. What must have been going through his mind? Was it triumph? Or was it the quiet, profound weight of a task completed, a cost counted in ships and men, a responsibility finally laid down? For the man who had inherited a navy in ruins, this moment was not an end, but a validation of a long and brutal faith. His war with Japan, however, did not end with that signature. It simply entered a new and far more unexpected phase. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. The man who had methodically dismantled the Imperial Japanese Navy became one of its most important preservationists. He learned that the historic flagship of Admiral Togo, the battleship Mikasa, was languishing in disrepair. This was the ship that had won the decisive Battle of Tsushima decades earlier, a vessel of immense national pride for Japan. Nimitz, the victor, personally led a campaign to raise funds in both the United States and Japan to restore his former enemy's icon. What could motivate such a gesture? Was it a profound respect for a fellow sailor, a recognition of shared traditions that transcended enmity? Or was it a strategic act of peacemaking, a belief that true victory meant not just defeating an enemy, but helping them reclaim their honor? Perhaps his most startling post-war contribution came not in a public act of charity, but in a quiet legal document. At the Nuremberg trials, the German Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz stood accused of war crimes, partly for his command of the unrestricted submarine warfare that had terrorized the Atlantic. It was a charge that could have carried the gravest penalty. But then, an affidavit arrived from a surprising source: Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz. In it, Nimitz stated with blunt clarity that the United States Navy had waged the exact same kind of unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific from the very first day of the conflict. It was a stunning admission, a statement that blurred the clean lines between victor and vanquished, right and wrong. This was not a man seeking to excuse an enemy, but a man of uncompromising integrity, acknowledging that the brutal necessities of total war had made their tactics indistinguishable. He was, in effect, testifying against the moral high ground of his own victory. The legacy of his leadership is not just in monuments or historical accounts, but is woven into the very fabric of the modern United States Navy. The command philosophy he championed, a principle known as centralized planning, decentralized execution, became gospel. He believed in giving his commanders a clear objective and then trusting them with the freedom to achieve it. This ethos, born in the vast, unforgiving distances of the Pacific, fostered a generation of bold and adaptable leaders. It moved the Navy away from rigid, top-down control and created a more dynamic and resilient fighting force. When a modern carrier strike group operates with a degree of autonomy, when a ship's captain makes a critical decision on the spot, they are living out the philosophy that Nimitz instilled in the crucible of the Second World War. His greatest impact may not have been a single battle won, but the creation of a command culture that continues to win them.